They're just like rules of math or rules of reason. Sometimes we get those things wrong too, but they have independent existence that influence our life. And for example, I believe in justice. I believe that people who do wrong things, if they're terribly wrong, ought to pay for that. I think you shouldn't punish people who are innocent in virtue of their innocence, because there are moral rules that guide that kind of behavior. Now, the alternate view is simply that objective moral rules do not exist. When it comes to questions of right or wrong, it's either up to the individual or it's up to the group, because ultimately it turns out that the answer to these difficult moral questions is simply whatever. Whatever the group decides, whatever you decide, because there's no way to adjudicate. There is no right answer to moral questions. Now, when I say that objective moral truths actually exist, I don't mean that I like them. Sometimes I might like them, sometimes I may not. I'm not talking here about my preferences. I'm not saying that all of my moral views are correct. I'm struggling to find the right thing to do in life like a lot of people. I'm just simply saying that I think there is a right answer that can be discovered. So in other words, when you say that child molesting is wrong, we are not talking about our feelings or our preferences or our tastes, but we're talking about child molesting. We're saying that particular action is wrong in itself, no matter who does it, no matter what culture it happens in. Now, I realize that there are complex issues involved in moral decision-making, but that's because morals are objective. If they weren't objective, if there were no right answers, then there would be no complexity. We'd be back to whatever again. So what I'd like you to do in this debate is I want you to watch for two things. First, I want you to watch for any evidences that I might give you that would be persuasive that there really are objective moral truths. Or I want you to watch for anything that Dr. Baker says or implies that suggests objective moral rules. Oftentimes when people try to deny morality exists, they end up smuggling in morality into the back door in their conversation. And if you see this happening, it tells you that the professor, though arguing against objective morality, implicitly believes in objective morality by the way he's speaking. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you three evidences why I think objective moral rules exist. How can you persuade somebody that something exists? The simplest way to do that is simply to point it out. If you don't believe that lecterns exist, I can show you this lectern. You have eyes by which you can see the lectern. And this helps you to perceive the thing and know that it's real. We have other kinds of eyes that help us to see things. That help us to see things that are not physical. If I said to you, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, therefore, what? Socrates is mortal. Now, how did you know that? Because you have a faculty that allows you to see something that is the relationship between those two propositions that allows us to come to a conclusion that is clear. And there's not any dispute about that. You're not seeing it with your senses, but you're seeing it with some other faculty. I think you have faculties like that that will allow you to see moral truths. You gaze upon certain circumstances and you intuit those moral truths apply to that situation. And so I'm going to present some of those things to you, and I'm going to ask you a simple question. And that question is, what do you think about these things? What is your assessment on these things? So here's my first piece of evidence, and you can put the first picture up, please. This is a picture of Matthew Shepard. He's from Laramie, Wyoming, and in October 1998, as a gay student there at the university, he was lured out of a bar by two men who said they were gay. They drove Matthew Shepard in a truck to a remote spot. They robbed him, they beat him mercilessly, and then smashed his skull, burnt his skin, cut him and bruised him, and hung him up on a wooden fence in 30-degree weather overnight. And this is a picture of that fence. Here's my question for you. Given this treatment that was done to Matthew Shepard, who, by the way, died just a couple of days later from the maltreatment that was given to him, what do you make of this? Are you inclined to say that what those men did to Matthew Shepard was wrong? How many people think that was wrong? Now I want you to think about this other question. When you say it was wrong, what are you describing? Are you describing your own feelings? Or are you describing the action itself? Are you saying that you feel bad? Or are you saying that what happened, regardless of how you feel, was bad in itself? Are you saying, well, our culture has agreed to call that bad? Or do you mean that that thing should never have been done because the thing itself was evil? If you are tempted to respond to that by saying those actions done to Matthew Shepard on that day in Laramie, Wyoming were actually wrong, then relativism is false. And some moral rules apply to this situation that were broken, and they were wrong even if the people who did it thought they were right. Matthew Shepard, first piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence. In 1982, I lived in Thailand for 7 months, and it was my responsibility to feed 18,500 Cambodian refugees that had escaped the Cambodian Holocaust. These are pictures of some of the kids at the refugee camp that I was at, Sakeo. I basically managed all of the food that came into that camp, 2.5 tons of fresh meat, 9 tons of vegetables, 56 tons of rice, 3,000 hot meals were served on a regular basis. The reason I was there is because these are the people that had survived the Cambodian Holocaust. In 1975 to 1979, the Cambodians killed themselves in mass through starvation, and execution. People were tied to trees with plastic bags over their heads to die a slow death of suffocation. Some were eviscerated when they were still alive so their livers could be taken out and eaten by the Khmer Rouge. Children were tossed up into the air, and they were caught by the soldiers on their bayonets and then tossed in a big tub of water in which the bodies putrefied, and then they made the people drink that water. They called that the baby broth. By the time the Vietnamese invaded and the Khmer flooded across the border into Thailand, creating the camps where I was serving, more than 2 million people had died. Half the population of the country. Bodies were piled in ditches, hung from trees, tossed into rivers, bulldozed into mass graves, sometimes buried alive in bomb craters, and these became known as the killing fields. Here are some pictures that the children themselves drew. Here you see a picture of executions done by a 14-year-old boy who asked the question, why were these people killed by the Khmer Rouge soldiers? What had they done wrong? Here's another picture done by a 12-year-old boy who said the Khmer Rouge killed so many honest people, they'd simply point their finger at you and call you an enemy and you were dead. You were an enemy if you wore glasses, if you spoke a word of French, if you went to school, if you had a nice shirt. All they had to do was say you were an enemy and you died. It was enough to make a person weep, and I wept many times thinking. Cambodian children, Cambodian people, genocide, second illustration here, actually third, regarding a second point. I want to tell you a story about Emmett Till. Back when I was a kid in Chicago, there was a young boy, 14-year-old black youth named Emmett Till, who traveled from Chicago to visit his cousin down in Mississippi. He was bragging to his friends about his white girlfriends back up in Chicago. And they said, hey, you don't have any white girlfriends. And so they dared him to talk in a fresh way to the woman at the store, and he went in and bought something there and said, hey, babe. 2 black men sitting outside said, you're going to be dead. They're going to kill you. And in fact, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 men arrived at the home where Emmett Till was staying and removed him at gunpoint. One of them was the white woman's husband. The next time anyone saw Emmett Till, he was unrecognizable. His face had been beaten, his skull smashed. His radically disfigured body was found floating in a river. The coroner was so upset that he just put the body in a box and shipped it home. And when Emmett Till's mother saw the body, she says, we're having an open casket funeral because I want them to see what they did to my boy. And this is what people saw when they came to the funeral home. So here's my question regarding these last 2 examples. The Cambodian people, 2 million dead. Emmett Till. If I were trying to convince you that God existed with stories like these in the headlines, what would your objection be? You would say, how could God, if He's good and powerful, allow all of this, what's the word that comes to mind? Evil. Let me tell you something, friends. That's the thing that everybody says when they see things like this. How could God allow so much evil?